Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're going to be diving into Andrei Bely's Petersburg.
Oh,
Yeah,
I love that book.
it's a dense one, but ultimately super rewarding. And people often compare it to like Ulysses or The Wasteland.
Oh yeah, for sure. It's a real symbolist masterpiece, and it kind of pushes those boundaries of language and how you structure a narrative. And it makes sense that a lot of the later modernist writers took a lot of inspiration from it.
Totally. And so Petersburg is a portrait of Russia,
Yeah.
pre-revolutionary Russia, of course. And specifically, it's focusing on St. Petersburg in 1905,
Right.
which is a time of just crazy upheaval.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think what's so cool about this book is how Bely takes those huge historical forces at play and kind of weaves them together with these really intimate personal struggles that his characters are going through.
Right. And before we get into like the nitty gritty, can you give us kind of a broad overview of the main themes that we're going to be looking at?
Sure. So I think at its heart, Petersburg is really about that clash between tradition and modernity that was happening in Russia. You see it playing out in society as a whole with the rise of all these revolutionary movements. But then you also see it playing out on a personal level, especially through the relationship between the father and son in the book. Senator Apollonovich Ablukov and his son, Nikolai Apollonovich.
And his son gets wrapped up in a plot to assassinate his father.
Yes, exactly. Nikolai is part of this group that's planning to kill his own father, who represents that old czarist order.
Wow.
So there's some tension there.
Talk about family drama.
Yeah, it's intense. But it's not just that. Bellini also explores the psychological struggles and existential struggles of all these individuals that are caught up in this crazy time period.
Right.
So his characters are all dealing with, these big questions of identity and purpose, and what does it even mean to exist when the world around you seems to be falling apart?
And then on top of all that, there's the city of Petersburg itself.
Oh, yeah. Petersburg isn't just the setting of this story. It really becomes like its own character.
Yeah.
A symbol of all those struggles that the Russian Empire was facing.
Okay, yeah, this is starting to sound
Yeah.
like a real masterpiece. So where do we even begin?
Well, the novel opens with this really vivid description of the city. Bely paints this picture of Petersburg as this grand, imposing place, but also a really unsettling place.
Yeah, there's that part where he talks about the architecture being really oppressive, almost like a cage.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He calls the buildings stone giants, looming over all the people.
Yeah.
And this idea of the city being a labyrinth comes up over and over, this really confusing and disorienting space that kind of mirrors what's going on inside the character.
Right, so it's like the city itself is a reflection of what's going on in their heads.
Exactly. And Bely emphasizes how it feels to be in the city, using all these vivid descriptions of sights and sounds to create this really overwhelming atmosphere of tension and unease.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. So there's this one passage where he describes the Neva River as this black ribbon winding its way through the city like a snake. And the sound of the wind howling through the streets is always there, like this mournful cry.
Wow, that's a powerful image. So in all of this, we're introduced to the Ablukovs, right?
Yep. We first meet Senator Ablukov at home having breakfast, and you immediately see how his personality kind of reflects this theme of order versus chaos.
How so?
Well, the senator is obsessed with order and geometry. Everything in his life is meticulously planned and controlled. He wants stability and predictability, and his house is full of these squares and cubes.
Oh, wow. So I bet he would just lose it if like a picture frame was slightly askew.
Oh, probably. And
Yeah, right.
you see that rigidity in his worldview, too. He's a big supporter of the Tsar, and he's terrified of change. And anything that might threaten the way things are, he thinks all these revolutionary movements are super dangerous and just bring chaos.
So he really embodies tradition, clinging to the old ways.
Exactly. And then you have his son, Nikolai, who's basically the complete opposite.
Yeah, he's a modernity guy.
You could say that. Nikolai's a university student, and he's drawn to these radical ideas. And like we said, he's involved in this plot to kill his dad. He thinks the revolution is necessary to break free from this oppressive past and create a new society that's more just.
Wow. That's a lot for a family to deal with.
It's super complex, and their relationship really highlights that bigger conflict that was happening all over Russia at the time, between tradition and modernity.
So how does that tension play out between them?
Well, their interactions are always really strained. There's this sense of resentment, and they just don't understand each other. The senator thinks his son is a disappointment, this threat to everything he believes in.
And Nikolai probably sees his dad as like Holding back progress.
Exactly. And Billy uses this imagery of doubles and doppelgangers surrounding the father and son to show how they're connected and how they share these anxieties, like they're two sides of the same coin, stuck in this unavoidable conflict.
So you have that clash of ideologies. But how does the revolutionary plot actually start to unfold?
We're introduced to it through Nikolai and his involvement with this group of revolutionaries. And Bely does an amazing job of creating this atmosphere in the city of paranoia and suspicion.
Yeah, it's all like shadowy figures meeting in dark, smoky rooms.
Totally. And whispers of revolution are spreading everywhere. You get the feeling that something big is about to happen, like the city's about to explode.
And at the center of it all is that bomb.
Right. The bomb becomes this huge symbol in the book, representing all that tension and the potential for this massive, violent upheaval. It's like a ticking time bomb.
Right.
Both literally and figuratively.
So Nikolai's stuck in the middle of all this.
Exactly. He's
Yeah.
torn between his revolutionary ideals and the fact that what he's about to do could have these really awful consequences. And you can see how that internal conflict starts to mess with his mental state.
Yeah, so we're starting to see that psychological struggle you were talking about.
Right. And as the book goes on, things get even weirder, more surreal and fragmented. All the characters' mental states start to deteriorate.
Yeah, I remember it jumps around a lot, and it's not always clear what's real and what's not.
Totally. Bely plays with how we see reality. You start to see these hallucinations and delusions, especially with Nikolai and this other character, Alexander Dudkin, who's also involved in the plot.
So the lines between what's real and what's not start to blur.
Exactly. And he does this to really get inside his characters' heads, to show us how all their anxieties and fears are changing how they see the world.
So we've got this mix of the personal and the political, and the real and the surreal. What else should we be looking out for as we read?
Well, Bely's use of symbolism is really important. He uses colors and objects and even the characters themselves to represent these bigger ideas and themes.
Could you give us an example?
Yeah, so the color red is used throughout the book
Mm-hmm.
to represent danger and revolution and the breakdown of order. And the image of the city as a labyrinth shows how confused and disoriented the characters are, both physically and mentally.
So it's like a giant puzzle.
Hmm.
And we have to figure out all the clues that Bely gives us.
Exactly. And that's what makes Petersburg so challenging, but also so rewarding. It forces us to think, to question what we think we know, and to be okay with getting lost in its world.
And I bet there are some passages in the book that really capture that.
Oh, for sure. There's this one line that I think sums up the themes of time and history and the human condition. Time, gentlemen, is a crooked thing. It's such a simple line, but it says so much about how Bely sees the world.
I love that. Okay, so we've set the stage, we've introduced the characters and the main themes. What happens next?
Well, the story really starts to pick up speed as we get closer to the assassination attempt.
So the tension really ramps up.
Oh, yeah. And you see the characters get sucked further into their own psychological turmoil as they try to deal with the choices they've made and the potential consequences.
This is getting good. Can't wait to dive into the next part.
Me neither. There's so many twists and turns and surprising things that happen that we haven't even talked about yet.
Well, for our listeners, we'll be back soon to continue our deep dive into Petersburg. Until then, happy reading.
Picking up where we left off, things really start to unravel as we get closer to the assassination attempt. Nikolai is just weighed down by his decision, and that bomb is always there. It really starts to wear him down mentally.
So his internal struggles are starting to show up in his actions.
Exactly. One of the most interesting things Bely does in Petersburg is how he blurs the lines between what's happening inside the characters' heads and what's going on in the world around them. Like Nikolai's anxiety and paranoia kind of mirrors all the chaos that's happening in the city.
So it's not just a personal struggle, it's also reflecting this broader societal turmoil.
Exactly. And don't forget, Bely was writing this after the 1905 revolution failed. So all those anxieties and uncertainties of that time are baked into the novel.
Okay, so how does that actually play out in the story?
Well, you start seeing Nikolai have these hallucinations. His thoughts are all jumbled up. He even talks about feeling like his body is dissolving, like he's losing touch with reality.
And that's all connected to the bomb, right?
Yeah, totally. The bomb becomes like a physical embodiment of his guilt and anxiety, this constant reminder of what he's about to do. Bely even describes it as if it's alive, ticking away like a heartbeat, almost like it's mocking Nikolai's terror.
That sounds really creepy.
It is. And as Nikolai gets worse mentally, he becomes more and more isolated from everyone. His relationship with his father, which was already bad, just completely falls apart. The senator is so stuck in his ways, so obsessed with keeping things the way they are, that he can't even see what his son is going through.
So it's this tragic disconnect between father and son. That reflects the larger disconnect between tradition and modernity.
Exactly. And Bely uses this parallel to show how impossible it is to truly communicate and understand each other in a society that's being ripped apart by these opposing forces.
And then there's Dudkin, who's also super involved in all this.
Yeah, Dedkin's story is really interesting because it's a journey of transformation for him, both physically and spiritually. He starts out as this really dedicated revolutionary, believing that violence is the only way to achieve change.
But then he starts to question those beliefs.
Right, as the story goes on, he becomes disillusioned with the whole movement. He sees all the hypocrisy and infighting, the power struggles, and he starts to realize that maybe the revolution isn't the answer he thought it was.
And what about his relationship with Nikolai?
He gets more and more worried about Nikolai's mental state. He tries to talk to him, tries to convince him to back out of the plan, but Nikolai is too far gone at this point. His mind is completely consumed by the bomb and his own inner demons.
So we have these two characters, both spiraling down this path of disillusionment and despair.
Exactly. And through their journeys, Billy explores these complex questions about ideology, the dangers of being a fanatic, and how pointless it is to try and force order onto a world that's inherently chaotic.
But what about the senator? How does he react to all this?
At first, he doesn't even realize how bad things are. He's too busy worrying about keeping his own position and upholding the old order.
So he's completely blind to the storm that's brewing.
Totally.
Hmm.
But as the novel progresses, you start to see cracks in his facade. He's forced to confront the reality of the revolution, the possibility that everything he believes in could be destroyed.
And what about his wife, Anna Petrovna?
Oh, yeah, that's a really fascinating part of the book. When Anna Petrovna comes back to Petersburg after being away for so long, it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the family drama. She's a really mysterious character. Her motives are never totally clear.
So she's kind of an enigma.
You could say
Yep.
that. And her arrival throws the senator off balance. He's already feeling insecure, and now he doesn't trust her. He's not sure what she's up to.
So you have this mistrust and suspicion within the family. That mirrors the mistrust and suspicion that's happening all over Petersburg.
Exactly. And Bely uses these parallel dynamics to show how the breakdown of order is happening everywhere, on a personal level, within the family, and in society as a whole.
Okay, so things are getting really chaotic and messy. What else should we keep in mind as we read?
I think the city as a symbol becomes even more important in the second half of the book. Bely describes Petersburg as this labyrinth, this dreamlike place where the lines between reality and illusion are constantly shifting.
Yeah, those descriptions of the architecture are really vivid, almost like the city is alive.
Exactly. He uses those descriptions to create this feeling of oppression, this sense that something terrible is going to happen. There are all these shadows and reflections and distorted perspectives that add to the overall feeling of unease and disorientation.
So like the city is mirroring what's happening inside the characters.
Exactly. And there's that famous line where Bely describes the city as a whirlpool, sucking everything into its depths. It's such a powerful image, and it really captures that feeling that the characters are caught up in something they can't control.
That's a great image. So there's this sense of impending doom, this feeling that things are spiraling out of control. Where does Bely go from there?
Well, the story builds toward this climax. That's both shocking and inevitable. The bomb, which has been ticking away the whole time, finally explodes, and it destroys the lives of all these characters, leaving behind this profound sense of loss and disillusionment.
So it's a tragedy on multiple levels.
Absolutely. And Bely doesn't give us any easy answers or resolutions. The book ends on a note of ambiguity, leaving us to think about all the complexities of human nature, the power of the past, and the uncertain future of Russia.
It sounds like a book that stays with you long after you finish reading it.
It definitely does. It's challenging, but it's also really rewarding. It forces you to think about the big questions, about life and death, identity, the meaning of existence. And I think it still speaks to readers today, especially in a world that feels as chaotic and uncertain as the one Bely describes.
Okay, so we've talked about the characters and the themes and all that, but what about the style? What makes Bely's writing so unique?
It's super innovative and experimental. He plays with language and narrative structure and perspective in ways that were totally groundbreaking for his time.
Can you give us some examples?
Sure, he uses a lot of stream of consciousness narration, so you're really inside the characters' heads, experiencing their thoughts and feelings directly. He also uses a ton of wordplay and puns and made-up words, which creates this really rich and textured language.
Sounds like a real workout for the brain.
It is. And he's also a master of symbolism. He uses colors and objects and these recurring motifs to represent bigger ideas and themes. Like I said before, the color red is often connected to revolution and violence. And the city itself becomes a symbol for all the struggles the Russian Empire was going through.
So it's a book that really makes you work as a reader. You have to pay attention to the details and figure out all the symbols and be okay with getting lost in this crazy world he creates.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so rewarding. It challenges you to think in new ways about the world, about yourself, about what's real and what's not.
So to wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key things our listeners should keep in mind as they continue reading Petersburg?
Well, I think it's important to pay attention to how Bely blurs those lines between the inner world of the characters and the world around them. The city of Petersburg becomes a mirror, reflecting their mental states, their anxieties, their hopes and fears.
And don't forget about all the symbolism. Pay attention to those recurring motifs, the colors, the objects. Bely uses those things to create this really complex text
Yeah.
that forces you to engage with it.
And lastly, don't be afraid to get lost in that labyrinthine world. Embrace the ambiguity, the uncertainty, the fragmented nature of the story. Because it's through that process of disorientation and discovery that you can truly appreciate how brilliant this book is.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here,
Yeah,
but there's still more to explore.
definitely. In the final part of our deep dive, we're going to look at the climax of the novel, the aftermath of the explosion, and the impact that Petersburg has had on Russian literature and beyond.
So for our listeners, we'll be back soon to finish our journey through Andrei Bely's Petersburg. Until then, happy reading. All right, so welcome back to our deep dive into Petersburg.
Oh,
We left off with the city on the brink.
yeah.
Everyone kind of coming apart at the seams.
Yeah.
And the bomb just ticking away.
Yeah, things are about to get real.
So where do we go from here?
Well, the climax of the book is super powerful and symbolic. It all centers around that explosion, which isn't just a physical event, you know. It represents the old order being completely shattered, chaos breaking into the character's carefully constructed world.
So everything just kind of implodes.
Pretty much. But it's interesting how Bely deals with what happens after the explosion. He doesn't focus on the physical destruction so much, but more on how it affects everyone psychologically and emotionally.
So it's more about the internal fallout.
Exactly. Like the senator who was so obsessed with order and control, he's completely broken by the whole experience. He sees what's left of his son, and he's forced to face the consequences of his own inability to connect with Nikolai.
So his whole world falls apart.
Yeah, basically. And then there's Anna Petrovna, who had come back to Petersburg hoping to reconcile with her family. She's devastated by losing her son, and she ends up leaving the city, kind of like she's searching for meaning and healing.
So both parents are dealing with this overwhelming grief and guilt.
Absolutely. And then you have Dudkin, who somehow survives the explosion, but he's really messed up, both physically and emotionally.
I can imagine that experience would change someone forever.
It does. He has to rethink everything he believed in. His faith in the revolution is gone, and he's just left wondering what the point of it all was. In the end, he finds comfort in simple things, just the everyday routines of life.
So there's this sense of disillusionment, but also a kind of quiet resilience.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of Bely's message about what it means to be human. Even when you're faced with tragedy and chaos, there's still this ability to survive, to find meaning in the middle of it all.
It's interesting that Bely leaves the ending open. We don't know what happens to any of the characters. It's like he's saying the story keeps going.
Right, and I think he does that on purpose. He wants us to think about what these events mean, not just for the characters, but for Russia as a whole. Remember, he's writing this during a time of huge upheaval. The future of Russia is uncertain, just like the future of his characters.
So Petersburg isn't just a story. It's a reflection of a really important moment in history.
Exactly. And I think that's why it still speaks to people today. It deals with these timeless themes of change and uncertainty and trying to find meaning in a world that feels chaotic and unpredictable.
You know, as we've been talking about this book, I keep thinking about how different Bely's writing is. It's not a typical story at all.
Oh yeah, it's definitely experimental. He uses stream of consciousness and symbolism, and he layers all these images and ideas on top of each other.
It's like he's creating a whole new way of seeing things.
Exactly. And that's what makes Petersburg so challenging, but so rewarding. It makes you work as a reader. You have to engage with the text and question everything you thought you knew, and just be okay with getting lost in this crazy world he creates.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key things you want to leave our listeners with?
Don't let the book's complexity scare you away. Be patient. Let yourself get swept up in Bely's language and his vision.
And don't forget about the symbolism. The city, the bomb, the colors, all those recurring motifs, they all have deeper meanings that make the book even richer.
Absolutely. And finally, think about how this book connects to our own time. All those themes of social and political turmoil, trying to find meaning in a world that feels like it's falling apart, those are things we're still dealing with today.
Very true. Petersburg is a book that stays with you. It makes you think. And I think it's a book that everyone should read at some point.
I completely agree.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Andrei Bely's Petersburg. It's been a great conversation.
Yeah, it has.
And to our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this exploration of one of the true masterpieces of Russian literature. We'll see you next time.